Hello everybody and welcome to another hobby cheating video. This week it's time for part 2 in a series on Drogs, I don't know, the really cool goblin boss. Let's get into it.
The strict technomancer that is Vincey V. Let us get to the technique and learn it Vincey V.
So last week I painted the chubby little goblin himself. This week we're going to turn our attention to the wolf. He's the more major part of the figure, at least by surface area, and he also presents some unique challenges that we're going to tackle. It's going to be a lot of fun. We're going to talk about how to paint fur, and specifically how to paint dark fur. Let's head over to the desk and let's get painting. Alright, so right now as he stands, he has a very minor zenithal on him. And that zenithal is there because I wanted to initially just kind of, have some minor highlights, map out the figure, be able to see the pieces and parts better. But we need to darken everything down. So most wolves have a sort of dark top and then lighter colored belly fur, like a lot of natural animals. So that's what we're going to do here. I'm going to start with some contrast paint at this stage. We're going to take some Wildwood, which is a really wonderful black-brown. I actually love this contrast paint. And we're just going to thin it down. I've got a moist brush anytime I'm putting it over it, but I just go over the whole wolf, everything. Even on the flat areas, I just make sure I smooth it out a lot. I'm not super worried if we get a little bit of coffee staining, and we will. But that's why we're using this first. We're just using it to set the general tone, darken everything down, and really get that into that more brownish black tone. Because this is a natural creature. We want it to have a little bit of that color to it. If it's just in black, it's going to be a little boring. So I just give a nice even coat, apply it everywhere. Job's a good one. I'm just moving my brush very quickly, using a very large brush, very important, and that brush is moist every time. Like every few applications, I re-dip into my water and then go back into the contrast paint. I then let that dry. Actually, the longest steps of painting this whole thing were really just letting these sort of all-over washes dry. Okay, so once that's dry, I'm then going to take a little bit of Nuln Oil and just work the fur and the top part. So not anything that's flat. So not any of like his haunches or his legs or the muzzle or anything like that. We're just working the fur. And that's because he has this really nice, really heavy fur. And again, I want to push the darkness on the upper part of him. So we're going to go ahead and just basically take that Nuln Oil and I just, again, give a nice moist brush, big brush, apply it all over the top. This time, anywhere where there's fur, exposed, visible fur. Now, as a point of fact, we're going to paint the whole thing like he's covered in fur, but there's clearly a difference as modeled between the more sort of like bushy, wild, mangy fur and then his underbelly fur. And so we're going to play into that with our paint job. Once that's dry, which again takes a little while, you can obviously speed this up with a hairdryer or something like that. But as I was doing this, my wife had borrowed my heat gun for her own purposes, and so I had to just kind of stare at him for a little while. Anyways, turnabout's fair play. I mean, I've borrowed so many craft supplies from her, so I have no ground to stand on. At any rate, now it's time to start tackling the actual fur. So we're going to break this into two parts. First, we're going to tackle the thick fur, the top fur. We want that to be darker. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take some of the Wildwood, and I'm going to work just with the Wildwood. I actually put it out on my palette, and I'm going to take a little bit of khaki. So this is from Pro Acryl. It's a very sort of mid-warm bone color. Really nice color. It'll give us a brighter tone. We're never going to go to pure khaki anywhere on this model, but it'll give us a nice lighter tone that'll really stand out from the very dark black. It's also got a little bit of yellow in it and stuff like that, so it's going to be more visually compelling than if I had just grabbed some kind of mid-tone gray. I'm then going to begin mixing that Wildwood on my palette with just little incremental bits of regular paint. This is something I think people don't do enough. Contrast paints are awesome for mixing with normal paints. Not only can you get cool colors that are natural highlights and extensions for the contrast paints, but also the contrast paints quite naturally thin your normal paint and make them easy to work with and layer with. So check it out if you haven't given it a try. So I work that down. Again, I'm just adding very incremental amounts. So like it's probably the very first layer here is like 90% contrast to 10% khaki. And I'm never going to, on the top fur, go above 30% khaki. So that's kind of the incremental thing you're seeing here. I basically just start working the individual little fur tufts. Now, in this case, he has very expressed individual clumps of fur, but we don't want to paint them all one color. So now I've switched to a very sharp brush, and I'm going to start doing thin lines up those. So each little tuft of fur will have multiple thin lines on it to make it seem like it's a bundle of hair or fur or whatever. And I'm just progressively adding more and more khaki, and I'm covering less and less and less of the total surface area, both as it's represented across the fur of the entire wolf on the top of him, but also each individual little strand. What I mean there is if you have an individual strand, you'll see as I highlight that my very first layer is with just very little khaki. I did lines from the base of the fur strand all the way to the tip. As I continue, I only am hitting the middle part of the strand. Think of it just like layering. It's no different. When you layer, you cover, this amount of area and then slightly less and then slightly less and then slightly less. It's exactly the same thing here. It's just instead of doing a single swipe, we're building that layer up through straight lines. A lesson I very much want you to keep in mind as we move away from the darker fur and go to the lower part of it. Now, really, that's it. It's pretty simple to get the fur on top done. Because we don't want it very bright, it needs to appear darker. So, now we're going to turn toward brightening up his haunches and everything else. And we're going to treat it as though he is a completely furry creature. So, now I just go and continue with the same ratios. Same paints, wildwood and khaki. This is a very simple paint job overall. It's like 3 paints used in the whole thing. I'm just going to make it a little bit simpler. So here I start with basically the same 30% mix, and that's my first layer here on the other parts. Now these are default brighter. They never got the Nuln Oil, so this will barely show. But it's still really important to do a bunch of individual lines, and as you can see, I'm running them perpendicular to the shape of the volume. What I mean by that is like on his haunch, it's going north-south from top to bottom, right? Same with his belly. But where there are other sorts of bends, I'm shaping the lines in the direction where the fur would naturally flow along his body. Okay, so the first layer, you're not really going to see much, but it will create the impression very lightly of those lines, and that's what's important. What we're then going to do is start integrating more and more khaki. Now, with this lower fur, I eventually get to a flipped ratio. Basically, 30% wildwood to sort of a 70% khaki, and that's going to be my highest highlight. But what I then proceed to do is just very carefully with a very sharp brush and a very high flowing paint build up and say do line after line after line, just lots and lots of lines, always building on top. Now I'm not trying to trace my previous lines. This is really important. Sometimes where I see people go wrong with this is they do a line like this and then they try to do every line right over top of it, right? Like just boom, boom, boom. That is not what you want. You want variation. The fur should have overlapping lines. It should be intermingled, random, organic, right? That's what creates the credibility. So we are not trying to make railroad tracks here on him, okay? So we mix that up, and each time, again, it's just shingles on a roof. You cover less and less and less each time as you get progressively brighter. Again, this isn't hard. If you think of it like layering, if you were layering, you'd cover the whole area in, the darker color, and then the slightly lighter color would cover less, and then slightly less, and slightly less, right? That would be your shingles on your roof. With this, we're doing the same exact thing, except instead of doing one swipe with the brush, we're going little itty hashes. Lines, 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 lines. It is a very tedious process, but after a little while, it honestly becomes kind of zen as you just continue to repeat these lines. I do them on his muzzle, on his face, on his haunches, on his feet, and so on. Now, importantly, I don't take the lower extremities of the creature, so his feet and his lower limbs. I do not take those to as high of a level of highlights as I do the upper parts, the top of his leg haunch, the very top of his tum-tum, and his face. Those areas go as bright as possible. And the reason for that is because we still want to force those highlights even on the where it's with natural creatures unusual because the brighter part is underneath, but we still want to respect that overall travel of volumes where there's less light down as we move down the figure. Okay, and I will work back and forth then, so I come in with like, I do all my lines, then I come back in with maybe another mix in the middle. I do some more lines to connect it where there might be too hard of a layer. Again, not trying to cover over the exact line, but just intermingling it throughout. Just doing lots of sharp, thin lines until I get a relatively smooth progression through the fur. Once that's done, and I have all my fur in place, it looks pretty cool. And honestly, you could kind of stop here if you wanted, but we're going to do some other cool details. So the next thing we want to do is, again, add a little more color. Right now, honestly, it looks okay, but it's kind of boring. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some Seraphim Sepia. And what I am then going to do is just very lightly thin that down with a wet brush. So I have a completely wet brush as it goes into the Seraphim Sepia. And then I'm going to very lightly filter that, just put a light application of it on the lower parts of each volume. Think of it like where you would put your shadow color. So the bottom part of the tummy, the bottom part of the muscles, those downward facing or lower perpendicular planes. I then feather out the edge slightly so it blends in. It's a very minor touch, but that additional punch of that yellow-brown in the shadows really does a lot to add to the overall impression of a living natural creature. Again, when things are painted completely in black and white, they are boring. So we want to bring in those subtle other hues and colors so when we can pitch in those slight yellows and things like that, it really just makes it more visually compelling. Okay, once that's all applied, then we've got tiny details. So, tiny details. Well, his little nose and his lip. He has a very clearly sculpted and expressed lower lip. As a lot of natural animals do, you can really tell their lower lip, just like on a person. And I actually had to go look this up. So here's a picture of a wolf, like a dark fur wolf. I wasn't sure what color their nose was or their lips were. It's not something I really thought about. I thought maybe they were like my dogs, and they are. It's the same thing as my dogs. They have very dark coal black noses and very black lips. So that's what we do. We take, in this case, just a straight black, any black will work, and we're going to just touch his little nose and then touch his little lips. But the other thing I noticed in the pictures is that, you can see here, applying that, whatever. The other thing I noticed in the pictures is that they're very shiny because dogs sweat out of their nose. I assume it's the same for wolves. I haven't looked up the science fact, but I assume it's true. So that's kind of how they help regulate their body temperature. So their noses and their lips tend to be very wet. So that means it's going to have a slight satin sheen. So what I actually do is take a little bit of that khaki, and in this case, I put just a little dot of it on the sort of end of his nose, and just kind of little staccato dot along his lip to create a very small light reflection on the black lip, so it looks like it's actually satin and reflecting. Think of it the same as when you put the life light or the little white dot in an eye. It's just showing that it's a very glossy, wet surface, and it's catching that reflection of the light. Came out pretty cool and simple. And I learned something. I don't think I've ever really thought about the color of a wolf's lip before, but turns out it's shiny black. Okay, this guy has one more little detail we need to talk about. This wolf has seen some battle. It's got some big, giant, kind of cuts in it of sorts. Now, I assume those are healed. I didn't assume they were active open wounds, maybe just scars, basically. I suppose you could paint them as open wounds. If so, I've got previous videos on doing open wounds and blood and stuff like that. But here, what I'm going to do is take some of this sort of pinkish vermilion color, which is the same thing I use for the goblin's actual pink in his nose to tie the two together as well. And I basically just trace a nice little staccato line along all the expressed flesh of each cut and deep scar. So you can see I just trace that along. Then I just mix in a tiny bit of khaki and apply a very light highlight on the bottom one where it's sort of an upward facing plane because it's the lower exposed flesh, and just kind of give it a very gentle, soft highlight. No real big deal. I also hit his gums, by the way, with the same color. And with that, our wolf is ready to go. I gave him some red eyes and teeth, of course, when he's all done. And that means the goblin is done. So how did Droogs come out? Well, here he is all finished up. I'm pretty happy with how he came out. This was a really fun model to paint. This is one of my favorite models GW has sculpted in a long time. It's full of character. It does not have an egregious amount of nonsense on it. It was an extremely pleasurable, fun paint job. I was able to do it in like a day or two without stressing or worrying about like finding out all the little nooks and crannies and bojangles and little dangly bits. None of that stuff. Other than the 4 little things on the shield, but I'll forgive him that tiny accoutrement. Anyways, it was really fun to paint. Would completely recommend picking this guy up. Seems like he's pretty good in the game too, so hey, what a win, right? But anyways, that was Droogs. Hey, if you liked this, give it a like. Subscribe for additional hobby cheating. That's a great way to support the channel. If you want to support us even more, there are links down in the description. You can, including our new affiliate link with Michigan Toy Soldier. So you can check out all those affiliate links. They don't cost you anything extra. In fact, they often save you money. For example, that Michigan Toy Soldier link has a 5% discount code when you use it at checkout. And it helps give a nice kickback to the channel. It is really deeply appreciated and helps keep the lights on. There's also, of course, the games Uncle Adam and I make. You can check those out to find your newest skirmish obsession. We happen to have a goblin-focused game called The Great Goblin Argle Bargle in our most recent issue of Snarl. And, of course, there's our Patreon focused on review and feedback and helping you take your next step on your hobby journey. We would love to have you as part of the community. As always, though, I thank you so much for watching this one. If you've got any questions, drop those down below. I always answer every question and every comment. But as always, we'll see you next time.